There's a decision that has been made twice in human history. The same decision made by a leader that has changed the future. And based upon this decision, if it had gone differently, I would either be speaking potentially French or potentially German. And you got to wonder, well, what's this one decision that could have changed the future like that? Well, the first time this decision was made was back during the times of Napoleon. You see, Napoleon was such a terrifying person to all of Europe that they formed a coalition to fight him because he was so good on the battlefield. He was such an amazing and effective leader. And so he gathered his armies, and a coalition of the kings of the nations, of the kingdoms of Europe rose up to fight him. And they lost. And so they formed a second coalition, and then a third. In all, there were 7 coalitions that fought Napoleon between the years of, 1792 and 1813. 7 times kingdoms got together to say, we have to defeat Napoleon. And the turning point was when Napoleon made a decision. It was a decision he did not have to make. He decided to invade Russia. And in invading Russia, he took on an enemy that he could not win against. The enemy was the Russian winter. He invaded, and he was able to conquer vast swaths of Western Russia. But in the end, he entered Russia with 685,000 men, and he left with 70,000, losing about 90%-ish, give or take. It's a rounding error at that point. At the point at which you've lost over 500,000 men at this point, a couple dozen thousand folks, just kind of how it goes, right? But that was a moment that it did not cripple French ability to fight at all. This happened during the time of the 6th coalition. But what it meant was that the French fighting power was diminished, such that the 7th coalition ended with the battle at Waterloo. You may have heard of this, the battle at Waterloo. So Napoleon, leader, he made a decision to invade Russia, and it crippled his armies. Down the road quite a bit, during World War II, the same decision was made. The same disastrous decision was made when Germany decided to invade Russia, Operation Barbarossa. And there was only one coalition fighting against Germany in World War II, not the 7 of the Napoleonic Wars. But the victory swung on this same decision. We have better records from this time, 186,452 Germans killed, and then 655,179 wounded. Nigh on 1 million people, 1 million Germans who were fighting for their cause, were knocked out of battle. And so opening the second front and invading Russia weakened German forces on a level that's really just hard to describe. Both times this decision was made to invade Russia, it changed the future of the world. And it's an example, it's a kind of an obvious example if you want to look across history. But it's an example of how what leaders do matter. And what leaders do matter, and leaders are people. And thus they are a mix of maturity and brilliance and immaturity and pettiness. For every leader you can point to across history, you can find people who are just the parts of their lives that are amazing, the parts that just are not. As we look at the leaders in Scripture, as we're doing right now, we see that this is the case for them as well. We see this mix, that Noah had the faith to build an ark, to build this boat, when it wasn't raining. And As soon as he got off the ark, he grew a vineyard so he could get drunk as soon as possible. We can look at Abraham, who was bold enough to leave and to go to another land. I am calling you to leave your father's land. And that's what he did. He left his father's land. He left behind everything that he was comfortable with, and he went. This is amazing. And he also passed his wife off as his sister twice, which not so amazing. David, King David, he respects Saul and the king before him and trusts God's timing, and he also kills Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, after taking her. Peter steps out onto the water and denies Christ 3 times. Paul began churches all over the known world and held the coats for the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. We could go on, but I think you see the trend here. The leaders in Scripture, much like the leaders that any leader we can point to today, are mixtures of maturity and brilliance along with immaturity and pettiness. And their decisions matter. And so we're going to look at, there's a particular leader in Scripture I want to look at today who gets it right. There are 2 leaders in Scripture for whom there are no mistakes recorded. And they have the same name. The first one is obvious. The person in Scripture who there are no mistakes recording, there are no errors recorded, he gets it right, is Jesus. Fully God, fully human. There are sermons about Jesus and his leadership principles and theories and practices. You can look at great length and how do I lead like Jesus and teach like Jesus, and that's all well and good, and I appreciate it. And it's intimidating because I'm not Jesus. Not a surprise. Like, to say lead like Jesus is good, but it's kind of scary too, because it's being held to a standard that I have no, I mean, I'm not the Son of God. Thankfully, there's someone else in Scripture that we can look at, and he has the same name. The name is Yeshua. The Hebrew name is Yeshua. And Yeshua, when it's translated through the Greek, in the New Testament, turns into Jesus. And Yeshua, when it's translated through the Hebrew, and we translate it into English, it's translated as Joshua. And so Yeshua is translated into Joshua and into Jesus. It's the same name. Joshua is the perfect leader. Joshua, he has a book named after him in the Old Testament. He is a perfect leader. That's not hyperbole. I'm not exaggerating it. He is one of 2 people in the Bible who are in leadership positions who we know something about at any length, right? For whom there are no errors or mistakes or sins recorded. And the Bible is nothing if not honest to a fault about the errors, the challenges of the people who are in Scripture. So we're going to look at Joshua, the first Yeshua in Scripture. And what we look at with him is that he follows Moses. Like that's the time frame in which he's doing his thing. Like Moses has led the people out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. They received the 10 Commandments. They've wandered through the desert for 40 years. They've gone through what we now call Deuteronomy, where they rehashed the law for a second that means the second time, and they're ready to go into the promised land. And Moses dies, and Joshua is the one who steps forward, and he inherits this position, this mantle of authority, and all the teaching that has occurred, and the way that Moses has organized people into the 10s, 5s, and 100s so that they have leaders over each of these levels of groups. Like, he inherits all of this, and he takes the people, and they go through the River Jordan, and they go into the promised land. And what makes him perfect, and the great leader obviously, is that he has it all figured out. Right? He knows the plan. He knows where we're going. He knows how it's going to unfold. He knows what's going to happen. He can guarantee it's all going to go according to the list, according to the check marks, and it's all going to come in under budget. Nope, he can't. And that's not what happens. One of the great fallacies surrounding leadership is that leaders know everything about what's going to happen, that they have it all figured out, and that when we follow them, we can get rid of uncertainty from our lives. Because a great leader lays it all out, and that's just how it goes from there. That's what we want in a leader, right? Someone who has it all worked out. It doesn't happen. That's not what we see with Joshua. Joshua had been one of the 12 spies sent into the promised land 40 years prior when he was a young man, and he sent into the promised land, and he was one of the 2 of the 10 who came out and said, we should do this. We can do this. The other 10 of the 12, the rest of them said, we'll get slaughtered. There's no way. Yes, it is a fruitful land, and it's full of big people. They will kill us. And so because the people believed this and they heard this and they said, you're right, we'll go and we'll get slaughtered. They had to spend 40 years in the wilderness to learn to trust, to learn to be God's people, to learn that how God is guiding them is wise and true, and they had to kind of grow up as a people. And so Joshua has been with them during this time. And then he leads them now into the promised land. So he is leading them into the promised land, which he saw briefly 40 years ago. And I think it's important to keep track of this, right? It's Joshua, the single best leader in the Old Testament, he's not other than like Jesus, Son of God. He doesn't have it all worked out. What he has trust is that he's headed in the right direction. He has a group of people willing to follow him. He has this vague sense of the lay of the land, and he says, follow me, and we'll handle it as we go. And that is what he does as a leader. Vague sense of the land, has the structure to make sure people trust him. He has the common sort of heritage there. They all are on the same page after 40 years in the wilderness. And then they charge. They go for it, and he's in front. And as I think about how that worked, about how Joshua, how he led, I'm reminded of one of the great organizations for teaching leadership that in our culture today. It's the American Army, our American Armed Forces. The way it trains officers, well, sort of you go through officer school, OCS, officer candidate school, and the way they train officers, second lieutenants, is make a decision. You'll never know exactly what's around the corner. You will never know all the details of whatever situation you're walking into. That's tough. Suck it up, make a decision, and go. And don't wait till everything is clear, because it will never all be clear. And then the people who are following the officers, the enlisted, are trained. You follow the orders of the officer. Because he's going to lead you, and you're going to follow, and that's how we're going to go. This is how leadership works. You got to be willing to go and do something. And this is what we see with Joshua. No matter how perfect a leader is, and Joshua is as perfect a leader as there is in the Bible, you're never going to know everything that you're getting into, and Joshua sure didn't when he led the people into the promised land. But he made a decision, he went, it's time to go, and the people followed him, and they worked it out as they went. It is the temptation of leaders to portray themselves as having everything figured out, right? That's the temptation, to lean into this sort of cultural hope, this cultural expectation. You got it all figured out, Andy? Oh yeah, I have it all figured out. I'm going to be a great biblical leader. I'm going to have it all figured out. I know exactly what we're going to do, and I know how it's going to turn out, and I know what the results are going to be, and it's just not the case. I can't tell you I have it all figured out. What I can with Joshua say is, I've got a direction. I've got a direction. Right? And anyone who says they have it all figured out, I'm immediately worried about them. I'm wary. If someone says they have it all figured out, I think they're wrong. Because even if they do have it figured out for that one time, that's just one time. And leadership is full of a lifetime of weird, unusual situations. I can say this as I've been in leadership positions since I was 17 doing my Eagle Scout project, right? I hope one day to be decent at leadership, but what I can tell you is every time you lead in anything, something goes off the rails. It is not about having everything perfectly worked out ahead of time. It's about knowing your project, knowing your goal, knowing a direction, having people who are willing, understanding why it matters, and then being able to roll with life. I did that Eagle Scout project, and the project was to move, there were 2 hunting blinds. There were 6 posts that they sat on, and they had a roof and a long ramp up to them. They were wheelchair accessible hunting blinds in a part of Illinois that was federally owned, and was going to be, they could be used for hunting. And after they had been built, it was realized that that was where there was unexploded ordnance. It wasn't right there next to the hunting blinds, but if you shot something and then you went to retrieve it, get the deer or whatever you shot, you could drive over or you could walk over unexploded ordnance that could potentially explode. It was ordnance going all the way back to World War II, unstable. And so we went in there to move these hunting blinds. And I had arranged all the people we needed, and we had block and tackle and pulleys, and we had a trailer, and we had the heavy rope to be able to pull it. We tied some knots that day, right? Boy Scouts tying knots, right? And we got, by the skin of our teeth, our goal was to move 2 hunting blinds. By the skin of our teeth, we moved 1 the first day. And as we were driving away that first day, we realized we can't do this again. It will whoop us, right? I had a week. We had to do it, the second half of it was to be the next Saturday. I had a week. I had to go find a cat and a driver who could be available that day, and I had to make sure I got approved so that I could be on that federal land with that cat, with that small cat. And that's what you did, right? Because that's how leadership works. I know my goal, I got my people, we understand the task, and then you roll with it. I ran jazz festivals up at Truman. The first time I ran a jazz festival, we were halfway through the day, 4 sites, 42 bands, and someone pulls the fire alarm, and everyone looks at me. What are you going to do? Someone pulled a fire alarm, and you have just bands, and your precisely tuned schedule falls apart quickly when someone pulls a fire alarm. And so I am honored to be trusted as a leader in the church. I am just floored by that trust, and I just know that nothing ever goes quite as planned. Or as I put in The Art of War, talking about the fog of war, The Art of War by Sun Tzu talks about how no plan survives contact with the enemy. Like, you make plans and then you see what happens. And that's what Joshua did, leading people into the promised land. And that's a whole sermon series of itself. What did Joshua do, leading people into the promised land? The lesson thus of leadership, looking at Joshua, the perfect leader in Scripture. There are 2 perfect leaders. One is the Son of God, and then there's this guy. And if I need to look at something that's not intimidating to do, I'm going to look at this guy. I'm going to look at Joshua. And the lesson here is, if you're going to be leading, the best you can expect is to be pointed in the right direction, pointed at the promised land, and knowing that you're going to be surprised. And then, if you're not leading, if you're following someone, the lesson here seems to be that leaders never have it all figured out. We cannot ask leaders to have it all figured out. The best we can do is to ask that they have a clear sense of where we're going and why it's important to get there. And together, I think that's probably one of the most important things we can look at leadership in Scripture, is what do we ask of leaders, and what do we expect of ourselves as leaders? And we're both, right? All of us lead in some capacity, all of us follow in some capacity. Hopefully, the goal being we're all headed towards the same goal. Leaders, followers, we're all heading towards Jesus and the kingdom that is to come, which we'll arrive at by the grace of God somehow. Thanks be to God.